Committee will come to order. Over the years, Congress has focused most of our attention on the military services and on weapons and equipment, personnel, and policy issues. We paid relatively little attention to the rest of DoD that makes up the Fourth Estate. In fact, one expert has said the Fourth Estate is untouched by human hands. Yet this portion of the Department of Defense spends about 20% of the budget, includes about 25% of the civilian workforce, and hires about 600,000 contractors. As we're working to get more value for the taxpayer dollar, to get more resources into the hands of the warfighter faster, and to make the department more agile and innovative in the face of the wide array of security challenges before us, we cannot neglect to examine this large portion of DoD. Yesterday, I offered a proposal to make reforms to a portion of the Fourth Estate. I look forward to receiving reactions to that legislative text. But beyond the specific proposals, I believe it's essential that we work across the entire department, leaving no stone unturned, to ensure that the warfighters have the best that this country can provide and that this enormous organization of DoD is ready and able to defend the nation. I yield to the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I agree this is an important hearing that we're having today on a substantial portion of the budget that does not get as much attention as it deserves. I wouldn't go so far as to say it's untouched by human hands. I think there are others that have come before us that have taken a swing at this, both in the department and in Congress, to try to look at the portion of the budget that's not directly related to the warfighter. And there is, without a doubt, I don't think anyone would argue there is savings that can be found there, and I think we should look and try and do that. And I think the chairman's bill that he introduced yesterday, or I guess the portion of our markup that he introduced yesterday to attempt to do that is a good starting point. I would say, however, what these people do is not irrelevant. There are a number of portions in the so-called Fourth Estate that are essential to assisting the warfighter in making sure that they're ready for the fight. So what we have to do in this committee is figure out how can we find savings without doing damage. And as I said, others have come before us and tried to do that. The Pentagon is a very difficult bureaucracy to get at. I certainly admit that, and I'll just close by saying I certainly applaud the chairman's efforts to take that run. I look forward to working with him to figure out the best way to do that, to make sure we cut in a sensible way that saves money and at the same time makes sure that we can continue to provide the services that our warfighters need so we can fight as efficiently as possible. I will stop there because the two gentlemen who are testified today know a lot more about this than I do, so it would be better to hear from them and get to our questions and answers. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. I certainly agree with the gentleman on all of that, including the fact that our witnesses have a lot of expertise to bring to the table. We welcome Mr. Peter Levine, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for Defense Analysis, but who has also been Deputy Chief Management Officer at the Department of Defense, and what I won't mention is some of his associations across the Capitol. We also have Mr. Preston Dunlap, who's the National Security Analysis Mission Area Executive at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory, but he too has experience in the Pentagon, including serving in CAPE and in other positions. Thank you both for being here. Without objection, your full written statements will be made part of the record, and we look forward to any oral comments you'd like to make. Mr. Levine?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Congressman Smith, members of the committee. First, it's good to see you all again. I thank you for inviting me here to address defense management in the DoD's Fourth Estate. I think it's a tremendously important issue, which is well worth your attention, and I believe that there are significant savings that are possible in this area. When I served as the department's Deputy Chief Management Officer, I was responsible for a program to carry out about $7 billion worth of savings over the course of the FIDP, and most of that we were looking to the Fourth Estate to achieve. I think it's important, though, not to have unreasonable expectations as we look at the Fourth Estate. As I point out in my prepared statement, a huge part of the Fourth Estate budget goes to the Defense Intelligence Agencies, the Missile Defense Agency, and the U.S. Special Operations Command. By some definitions, the combatant commands are also part of the Fourth Estate. So there's a huge warfighting function that is in the Fourth Estate. Within the balance, we pay for the Defense Health Program, which provides health care to our service members and their families, as well as the DoD schools and commissaries, which members of Congress have generally considered to be off limits for large cuts. The Fourth Estate also includes DARPA, SCO, and DIUX, all of which perform cutting-edge research needed to maintain our technological edge. If all those entities are considered to be essentially off the table for budget reductions, and I don't mean to imply that there are no efficiencies possible, but if the large budget reductions, if we're looking at the rest of it, we have about a quarter of the Fourth Estate left to look at. So you can't achieve 25% reduction in the Fourth Estate by looking at only a quarter of the budget. Unfortunately, the everything else also performs essential functions. I think that these are functions that can be performed more efficiently and that deserve close attention from the committee, but they're important functions nonetheless. This includes a number of small defense agencies that perform specialized functions like DPAA, DSCA, DITRA, DTIC, DITSA, TRMC. We can go through any of those that you want, but my point on that would be the overall cost of those small agencies is relatively small. Their functions have to be performed somewhere, so there are savings. I believe that the small agencies can be made more efficient, but you're not looking for big dollars there. If you're looking for big dollars, you're probably looking where others have looked, which is to the big business-type defense agencies like DLA, DFAS, and DISA. That's sort of everybody's favorite target for budget cuts in the Fourth Estate. Before those agencies were established, the Department ran parallel activities in each of the services, multiplying the overhead and the number of people needed to perform the work. DLA and DFAS, the two agencies that get most of the complaints because of their size, had almost 100,000 employees between them when they absorbed functions from the services in the 1990s. Today, they perform the same work better with 34,000 employees. That's about a $6 billion a year annual savings from the personnel reduction that they were able to accomplish by bringing in tasks from the services and consolidating them. I've been following DLA for almost 30 years now, and I've watched it evolve as a business, reaping savings by instituting best practices from the private sector like direct vendor delivery, prime vendor contracts, electronic contracting, electronic tracking, asset visibility programs, and a business systems that actually work, unlike most of those in the Department of Defense. Over the last 5 years, DLA has executed a cost reduction program that targeted contracting, personnel, acquisition of assets, travel, transportation, supplies and equipment, rent, and maintenance. This program was expected to achieve about $5 billion of savings over the FYDP. As a result of these efforts, I think DLA is one of the best-run businesses in the Department. That doesn't mean that further savings aren't possible. They are, and the committee should pursue them. I think we just need to understand what's gone before as we look at those. DFAS is also a relatively efficient organization and outperforms what the services did 25 years ago, but I see a difference here. Both DFAS and the services have evolved considerably and have new capabilities since DFAS was formed 25 years ago. Given the new ERPs in the services and the new capabilities that they have, I think it's long past time for a complete reexamination of the role that DFAS and the services play, and there should be streamlining that's possible. There may be functions that can be transferred from DFAS to the services, but a real considered approach to that and figuring out how those functions work is necessary. I'm less familiar with DISA, but I know that it runs data centers that are sometimes considered to be underutilized and overstaffed. It's tough cutting these kinds of things in the department without a BRAC, though, so if you're willing to take that issue on, not a BRAC issue, but the issue of data centers and whether they're efficiently utilized, more power to you. Finally, I'd like to say just a few words about two defense agencies that reported directly to me when I was in the department. Everybody in the Pentagon loves to criticize Washington headquarters services. It can be maddeningly unresponsive at times, but it performs essential functions without which the Pentagon could not operate. It runs the power plant and utilities, maintains the building, allocates office space, contracts for food, handles the budget, runs personnel system, controls ID cards and parking permits, among other functions. It'd be nice to think that we could save money by eliminating WHS, but somebody has to provide these services. Similarly, with the Defense Human Resources activity, which reported to me when I was acting Undersecretary for Personnel and Readiness, that's a notoriously inefficient agency. And there have to be savings that are possible. But recognize that it performs a bunch of activities that we really can't avoid. and many of which are mandated by Congress. It runs the Department's education and training programs and its manpower data systems. It staffs the Jammers program, the Suicide Prevention Office, the SAPRO office, and the Defense Travel System. It's responsible for the accommodation program for disabled employees, the Veterans Transition Program, employer support for the Guard and Reserve. The elimination of DHRA makes no sense unless those programs are also going to be eliminated. So, Mr. Chairman, in conclusion, I appreciate the committee's ambition in looking at this issue. I think it's tremendously important. I think you can find efficiency. I think you can find significant savings, and any savings that you achieve will be a tremendous victory for the Department and the taxpayers. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Mr. Dunlap.
Chairman Thornberry, Ranking Member Smith, distinguished members of the committee, it's an honor to appear before you today to discuss the oversight and reform of the Fourth Estate and defense agencies and field activities in particular. It's also excellent to be joined by my colleague Peter Levine here today. Though, as the chairman said, I currently work at Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Lab, I'm here today in a personal capacity. In 2013, I led a review on this topic for Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel as part of the Strategic Choices and Management Review when I was the Director of Program Analysis and Chief of Staff in the Office of Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation in OSD. While I readily admit that my experience is slightly dated, the principles that were true then and what we found in reviews past, I think, remain relevant and true today. To that end, I'm going to walk through 6 false assumptions that plagued our review and other reviews that we looked at. And I hope that we might be able to progress here more quickly past them. And I do thank the chairman for throwing out the first pitch and getting the ball rolling on this, so thank you. Assumption number 1, defense agencies and field activities are homogeneous back offices. Each of the current 27 agencies and activities was initially created by statute to achieve greater effectiveness, spanning multiple military departments. These missions vary widely, as you know, from groceries to geospatial analysis to educating kids to engineering and so on. Though each organization does indeed have a back office or overhead, and a few do function as consolidated back offices, like the Washington Headquarters Service, the majority conduct a variety of what many consider valuable direct missions to the Department of Defense. Assumption number 2, the appropriated budget is the total budget. We're using publicly available data, unclassified data, so setting aside things like the intelligence agencies. The agencies get appropriated, as the chairman alluded to, roughly $65 billion, but some also receive additional funding via defense working capital funds from other DoD agencies, military departments, and even individuals that pay them for services. Working capital funds allow consumers, in some sense, some choice as to where to buy their services from, as well as flexibility and agility to respond to pressing needs. That included, all told, they execute roughly 16% of the DoD budget, or over $116 billion. But as I mentioned before, each in a different way. And when you think about 25% or the right target, thinking about both the appropriated as well as revenues and other appropriated budgets that get sent to these agencies for execution should be considered. Assumption number 3, the agencies can take cuts and still perform the same level of mission. And I appreciate the chairman's comments that and when you look at this, you should think about not only cuts, but also dropping missions that might not be important or relevant in today's time. In a bureaucracy, it's often harder to cut a mission than it is simply to cut funding. But of course, they're related. It's appropriate to take hard looks at doing the same mission or even more for less, but if savings are an objective, then tough decisions may have to be made about actually doing less for less. For example, one that's often cited is DoD's grocery stores or commissaries or DoD schools, which of course provide a valued service to military families that can be difficult to find in some areas overseas or remote areas in the U.S. That said, roughly 85% of commissaries are located within a 15-minute drive of a grocery store or a big box store with full grocery selections. Options to save here or these type of agencies would include a careful review of the business case for each particular location, store, school, and so on. Assumption number 4, peanut butter spread cuts are helpful. When faced with tough decisions, past reviews often defaulted to a peanut butter spread approach to efficiencies, such as multiple years of 10% cuts in a generic fashion. A better approach, I think, as the Congress recognizes, is to focus on what the nation most needs from these organizations, to emphasize those missions for the warfighter, and take efficiencies in lower priority areas or obsolete missions. Assumption number 5, reorganization is the answer. Is it wise for the same person to oversee an intelligence agency, a grocery store, and the Missile Defense Agency? Well, maybe. So our study in 2013 examined the implications of consolidating all those agencies under one leader versus grouping them by missions, similar to the way they are today. And we found it helpful to consider both the personal expertise of the leader as well as dividing the missions across the department and the Fourth Estate. Assumption number 6, it's all about metrics and reporting. The agencies and activities have been required to provide a biannual report to Congress, and in the past also produced metrics that were tracked by organizations like CAPE, my old organization, and at the time the Deputy Chief Management Officer. However, ultimately, there is no substitute for strong leadership. In our experience, the vision and experience of a leader who understands the mission of the particular defense agency or field activity they oversee and the need for greater efficiencies can, together with oversight and action from Congress, I think achieve the greatest steps. So going forward, any reform efforts might consider these and other lessons learned to give a sense of the magnitude of the issue, along with the 25% sort of target that's on the table. If all 7 agencies, we'll say 6 of those mentioned, are eliminated, that's roughly a 2% budget cut in total. So there's a long way to go between 2 and 25% if you set aside DISA and the transfer. So how do we think about that? There's 4 categories that could find further efforts to be able to get from that level of percentage up to 25 or whatever the right percent is. First, large agencies that have not recently been reviewed, like the Defense Logistics Agency or the Defense Information Systems Agency, which is put on the table already. Second, missions that might be partially accomplished outside the government, like Defense Commissary Agency or education activity on a location basis. Third, missions that are split between the Fourth Estate and the services still, like intelligence agencies, satellite development organizations, in these cases, of course, in coordination with the Director of National Intelligence. And fourth, those currently decentralized missions that may require increased leadership focused, given advances in both threat and technological opportunities like artificial intelligence and hypersonics, which could either be accomplished within existing structures like the Missile Defense Agency and Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, or with their own organizations. Ultimately, for any reform to be successful, it must be true both, as was said here, to the taxpayer as well as to the talented men and women in uniform who put themselves in harm's way each and every day around the globe. And I thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today on this important topic, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both. Mr. Levine, you've got a magic wand, and you can wave it and do 1 or 2 things when it comes to the Fourth Estate reform. What would you do?
The first thing I would do is to take a close look at the working capital funds. My colleague, Mr. Dunlap, referred to the fact that a significant amount of the funding going into the Fourth Estate comes from the services through the working capital funds. My concern about the working capital funds is they do what they're supposed to with regard to the buyer. The services have a pressure to become more efficient because they see the cost of what they're buying. But they don't have the desired effect in terms of efficiency with the seller, because the way the rates are set, they're set to make sure that the fund breaks even. So no matter how high your expenses are, you always know you're going to recover them. My belief is we need a mechanism that will give the customers, the services, visibility into essentially how the defense agencies are spending their money, how DLA, DISA, and DFAS are spending their money, so they can see the overhead and push back at excess expenses. I think that kind of mechanism would create sort of a cop on the beat to look at those expenses on a day-to-day basis, and nobody has more incentive to save money than the person who's actually paying the bills. So I think we need to build that kind of mechanism into the department. Second, there are a number of specific areas I would look at. The first one is healthcare management. I know that the committee just went through a major exercise of passing legislation on that. It's very significant legislation. The department has a long way to go to execute it, but I can't help but say the overhead in the healthcare area is extraordinary when we're maintaining 3 separate surgeon generals and the Defense Health Agency. I don't think that's an area where we're efficient, and you and the department are going to have to keep a very close eye on the implementation of this to make sure that it's actually implemented in a way that brings down the overhead and doesn't just add new organizations to an inefficient system. The third area that I would look at, and there are others we can talk about, the third area I would look at is finance and accounting. And I really think it's important to relook the whole relationship between DFAS and the services. When I was at the DCMO, some of the service comptrollers would come to me and say, look, there are things that DFAS is doing for me that I can now do myself because I have an ERP, an Enterprise Resource Program. It has the capability built into it, but I'm required to ship this stuff over to DFAS and have them do it. And the consequence is then it's in two systems, and then I have to hire more. DFAS has to hire more people. They have to go through a reconciliation process because it's in two systems. If I just did it myself, it would not. I could not only do it within the system I already have, but I could do it cheaper without the manpower to do the reconciliation. That's a substantial task to do that reexamination. But as I said in my prepared statement, there's been a lot of evolution and capability on both the DFAS side and the service side, and I think that whole relationship of who does what finance and accounting tasks deserves a comprehensive relook.
Okay. Mr. Dunlap, magic wand, what would you do?
Thank you. I appreciate the comments of my colleague here. I think working capital funds are both a bit of a mystery as well as a gem. Why do I say that? It's hard to track where everything goes, and the pricing, as my colleague pointed out, a gem because I think the Congress is also interested in agility and flexibility in the agencies to respond appropriately, and that's certainly pointed to as a mechanism to allow that flexibility and some choice where the choice is available for the different organizations to choose one organization or another. So there's both pros and cons to the approach, but it's roughly half of the sort of total appropriations that the defense agencies oversee, so it's appropriate to take a careful look at that. I think the biggest the thing here would be to splice out those functions across all the organizations that truly are more overhead and back office functions with an assessment that they be done more efficiently or effectively. I think a careful, hard look needs to be done. We did that in our review by bringing in each of the defense agency and activities heads. So I personally met with each of them, went through the org chart, the missions, what they were doing, and why they were doing them. To be able to get at that, it takes something like that, pressurizing leadership in the department to go have a careful, intricate look to support that. On the reform in terms of making them more effective and capable for the service members, they also provide a variety of capabilities that I think that the Congress thinks are important: intelligence information in light of foreign adversaries' capabilities, missile defense capabilities, and so we want to make sure that we emphasize those. And to that end, there remains, as I mentioned in the opening remarks, elements of those structures that remain both divested amongst the services and other organizations as well as in the Fourth Estate. I don't have a position on whether it's better to be in the Fourth Estate or to be divested back to the services, but I think there are several missions still in the defense agencies where we could look at that as part of this review and where things could be done better or worse. To get to that target of 25% or whatever the right amount is, we're going to have to take, the Congress is going to have to take a careful look at what to cut and what to stop doing. So I appreciate the 7 agencies mentioned, one of which is more of a transfer. But as I said, that only gets to about 2% of the budget if they were all eliminated, 2% of the 25%, I should say. And so I think the Congress will have to take a careful look at whether they are open to issues like Mr. Levine mentioned with what has typically been off the table with BRACs or education or commissaries, because you have to get agencies that are large to be able to achieve that kind of savings. So I just put that out there for consideration. Thank you.
Okay, I've got several things I want to pursue, but first I'll turn to other members. Ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You mentioned the word BRAC in that last little sentence there, and it's the first thing I want to ask you about. Of all the savings, how important would it be to give the Department of Defense greater flexibility in closing bases and moving personnel? Because we all know, I mean, BRAC's the big bite that people are reluctant to take in terms of actually closing bases, realigning them. But they're even within simply moving equipment around within DOD, or if you wanted to close an office in one place and open it up someplace else, you've always got this massive fight with, well, us, whatever district it is that you're closing down. So there's 2 questions in there. Number one, are there things that we could do to make it easier for DOD to shut things down and move personnel to sort of resist the political pressures that inevitably come from the district in question. And I'm talking about something as simple as if they wanted to move 4 C-130s from one base to another. There will always be a fight, and it'll always take longer than it should. So there's that smaller stuff. And then on the larger point, how important would be having a BRAC round to getting at some of the efficiencies that we're talking about here?
Mr. Smith, I'm not going to take on the political question of how you could possibly get a BRAC passed in the Congress. I
didn't actually ask you that question. I'm allowing you to live in your perfect non-political world.
I did manage to go through that once, and it was a remarkable experience. But in terms of the importance of BRAC, you may remember a few years ago there was this Defense Business Board study that said we could save $125 billion in all these different areas. About half of the savings that they projected, if I remember right, were in logistics and real property management. And so when I became Deputy Chief Management Officer, which was a little while after that Defense Business Board study, I tasked the Defense Business Board, or the Deputy Secretary tasked them, but at my suggestion, he tasked the Defense Business Board to go and look at logistics and real property management. Here you said that there's $50 billion of savings here. Tell us what we would do in order to achieve those savings. The one overwhelming recommendation the Defense Business Board came back with was, you need a BRAC. So I don't know that they thought, when they looked specifically at logistics and real property management, that they believed that there was really $50 billion of savings there, or that they had recommendations. But they said, if you want significant savings in these areas, what you need to have is a BRAC. So that's sort of one marker anyway.
Okay. Mr. Dunlap, do you have anything on that?
I can't answer how much of the defense agency reform, would require BRAC or not BRAC. Just a general comment is that on average, we sort of see a 10-year or so return on investment there. So there would have to be a recognition of upfront costs to be able to move out. There are some examples in the agencies not requiring BRAC where they're able to achieve efficiencies. I think Defense Finance and Accounting Service is a good organization to look to for that, where they consolidate a bunch of their offices across the country. I don't believe they're required any BRAC authority to go do that, but they were able, on their own volition, to take efficiencies there.
Thanks. Hey, related question, and then I'll just, if you want to comment on it, you may. You mentioned the commissaries, you mentioned some of the stuff locally. I mean, frankly, most of the stuff that we're looking at, when you say, we want to reform it, BRAC is a very good example of what we run into. You ask the question, why don't we reform it? And at the end of the day, it's because of, politics in a lot of cases. People don't want jobs lost in their district. They don't want things moved. So, I mean, if we're going to do this, we're all going to have to figure out some process for saying we're going to bite the bullet, allow the DOD to have greater efficiency despite how it may impact our individual districts. Yes, I understand the fantasy of that comment, but I think it's important because everything we're doing here is going to run into that brick wall. Even if we could all agree that there's one particular agency that has 5,000 people working at it, it's a total waste of money. We ought to do it elsewhere. It's going to be the mother of all fights because those 5,000 people are somewhere, and some group of people are going to fight for them. But on the commissary issue, and there are a number of issues like this that are basically things that the men and women who serve in their families, it's a convenience. It's something they like. It's something that they're used to. It's something that improves the quality of their lives in their belief system. Do you really think there are areas within that, like commissaries and elsewhere, that we could get to? And if so, how do we get to it in a way that convinces the service members and their families that this is okay, that we have a better option that's not going to negatively impact your life while we save money?
You may remember that a few years ago, the department proposed to eliminate the commissary subsidy, and Congress said no.
I do.
After that, we were able to work out with you and with your approval and with legislation an alternative course, which we hope, if it's successfully implemented, will reduce the subsidy without reducing the benefit to service members. So that, to me, is an example of the kind of reform that you can do, right, being cognizant of the benefits that you're providing, without removing those benefits, but still to provide them more efficiently. Just to take just a minute on the defense schools, My recollection is that the defense schools in the United States, we spend about $300 to $400 million a year, something in that range is my memory. For that price, we get extraordinarily good schools. The DoDEA schools match up very well against the better school districts in the country in terms of performance, and they're doing it with a sensitivity to the needs of service members and their children who move frequently, and so just the fact that they're defense schools means that they're more understanding of what kids are going through with their parents absent and with their parents in combat situations. They provide a tremendously valuable service. When we looked at that, the general consensus was if we got rid of the defense schools, we were going to have to provide an almost equivalent subsidy to local school districts around the country. So the savings would not be $300 or $400 million a year. It would be maybe some fraction of that, maybe a quarter of that or something. But for that $100 million, say, a year of savings, you are going to lose all the special capability that's provided for the defense school. So it's not just a matter of politics. I mean, there's a real value to some of these things and a real value to the benefits that we provide to our service members and what they do for us in terms of recruiting, retention, quality of life for service members. So it's easy to say, you know, if it weren't for the politics, we'd get rid of it. But you got to remember that there's a real value that we're providing as well.
Thank you for making that point. That's really odd, and that's exactly what you just said is what I want to say about that. A lot of times the savings looks big up front, but then you got to factor in everything that you just said, and I can't say it any better, so I won't repeat it. But I think you're right. The commissary model is the model that we're going to have to go through in this is how can we do it in a way, forgetting the politics for a moment, like you said, there's a real service that's being provided. So we're going to have to work very, very closely with the communities and with the service members to figure out, you know, how can we balance this out in a way that's going to make sure that the benefits are the same and the savings actually is realized. With that, I yield back. Thanks.
Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Chairman McDormberry, for addressing this important matter of the Fourth Estate, which manages a significant portion of the defense budget and represents oversight responsibilities of a large number of civilian and contractor workforces with roughly an annual budget of $100 billion. And Mr. Levine and Mr. Dunlap, thank you both for being here today. And even before I begin, Mr. Levine, I appreciate you commending the DoD schools and the sensitivity to military families. I feel the same is being done with commissaries, with a sensitivity and support of military families and giving opportunities for not just having the conveniences of home worldwide, but also providing for military family members, spouses, to have employment, understanding that they could be rotated out. And so we're really fortunate to have systems in place that are so positive and meaningful for morale and welfare. And for both of you, what is your assessment of the successes or failures of the past efforts to reform or render more efficient the Fourth Estate of the Department of Defense? And especially I'd like for you to begin with the description of the Fourth Estate for the benefit of observers of this hearing.
So the Fourth Estate includes the Office of Secretary of Defense, the defense agencies and field activities. Most people would also include the Joint Staff and the combatant commands. So that's sort of what you're talking about when you try to get your arms around the Fourth Estate. That oversimplifies it, though, because as Mr. Dunlap and I have been describing, those defense agencies are incredibly diverse and perform a wide range of missions. I can't say all of them are essential to the department, but many of which are essential to the department, many of which are directly related to warfighting. I think there have been repeated efforts to get at the management of the Fourth Estate. Most every administration takes that on at some point because most every administration is under budget pressure. I mean, we've gone through sequestration. We know what budget pressure is around here, but it's not new to the Department of Defense. My view is that each of those reform efforts has made a contribution. I look at DLA as an example. DLA today is a completely different entity from what it was when I first visited DLA in the 1990s, and it was this huge unruly mass that was barely managed. I think that improvements have been made over the years, but I believe that management reform is a continuous responsibility. It's something you can never leave, and every new leadership cadre needs to focus on it because it's not something that takes care of itself or that you're ever done with.
Great description of the fourth estate. I completely agree. Just the one large thing that results in one of the frustrations, which is if you do reduce emission and you end up not seeing the efficiencies or the savings, it can be quite frustrating both for the department and the Congress. Sometimes you can do these and to make a decision to reduce an agency, and the department has done this in the past as well, and it's kind of like squeezing a balloon. You move it over here, it just reorgs and shows up somewhere else. So keeping track on when you decide to cut an organization, reduce or eliminate, making sure that that in fact happens holistically. And in past efforts, it sort of stops there without being able to track the ultimate completion of those actions and direction. So it's an effort that isn't an instantaneous result. It's going to take time and oversight.
And in line with your balloon analogy, how frequently does the department assess the roles, functions, and relative value of the defense agencies and field activities that comprise such a significant element of the fourth estate? Each of you.
I think the department is always looking for cuts in fourth estate and efficiencies in the fourth estate. I'm not sure that it does a bottoms-up review of is this mission still needed in the way you're describing as often as it should, and I think it's something that can always be used.
I think, legislatively, I think there's a 2-year sort of biannual type of report and assessment is required. That said, every year for the President's budget and program and budget review, they are part of that process and evaluation. In terms of a holistic review, the closest and nearest one that I am aware of was the 2013 review that Secretary Hagel oversaw, and I'm not sure about years prior.
And really quickly, the GAO, Government Accountability Office, has assessed many of the cross-enterprise business operations of DoD, Department of Defense, as high risk due to waste, fraud, and abuse. Is that what you believe has occurred, each of you?
The GAO has assessed all of DoD as high risk due to waste, fraud, and abuse. I'm not sure that the defense agencies are any different from the rest of the department in that regard.
And thank you very much. My time is up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Davis.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I certainly appreciate your efforts here in attempting to reform the defense agencies. Tough thing to do, and I think you all are speaking to that. Of course, we don't have the advantage of having that draft, and neither do you. But I think trying to look ahead now and see where are those instances in which you've seen some successes in doing this, and those areas in which you think that perhaps the intent was a good one, but in the end, it wasn't able to achieve the required results. So I look forward to getting into this and seeing how we can do it in the most inclusive way. What have you seen in terms of models? Perhaps that's BRAC in some ways, or other reorganization attempts that you think we should be looking to try and really reflect here in our discussions.
BRAC goes to facilities. Facilities aren't the only things we pay for. We have a couple of other things that we need to look at. I mean, basically, the other category, you buy things, you have facilities, and you have manpower. If you're not focusing on things, because we're not talking about the acquisition system, that's a whole different issue.
Yeah,
You're really focusing on manpower, and how can you save manpower? That's military, civilian, and contractor. You have to look at a total force.
Yeah.
So there are issues you can look at about the balance of the total force. Military tends to be much more expensive because we have to train and retain, and so we have a lifetime investment in military. If we're using military for functions that could be performed by civilians or contractors, that's probably not a good idea. There's analysis that can go into that.
Mr. Levine, if I may, is there an organization or really a process that you think has been a good model? And I'm thinking of making sure that people who are on the ground, who know this stuff and work with it every day, are included, as well as those who have fresh eyes on the prize, essentially.
So a model I would offer you is what we used for looking at service contracts, which is an important area to look at. We had, throughout the department, something that's called Service Requirement Review Boards, SRRBs. They're sometimes called contractor courts, where the leadership of an agency or an entity service systematically reviews its own service contracts and requires a bottoms-up justification for what they're spending on service contracts. And so the people who were responsible for those contracts have to come in and present this is what I'm spending and why I'm spending it. That SRRB process started in the services. When I was DCMO, we expanded to the defense agencies to make sure that they were under that same kind of review. But that model of the contractor court, the SRRB, is something that can be applied, I think, to other areas of the department as well.
Mr. Dunlap, would you agree with that? And do you get people that are willing to say, you know, listen, we don't need this?
I think the important thing, and I think you might be alluding to this, is talking particularly to the people both that run the organizations and the beneficiaries of the organizations and outside perspectives as well. That was extremely valuable in the review that I was involved in. And I found, depending on the particular leader at the time, some actually quite open to talking about where they could see their organization being more efficient and effective, yet were limited for a variety of reasons that have been mentioned here, outside and inside the department. And so I think that's been excellent. I think there are good examples like DARPA with technologies that are a great idea of what the defense agencies are about.
If I could stop you because I have so little time. How do you see doing this within healthcare management? How do we, I mean, I know this is a really difficult one in terms of the hierarchies within the different services. Is that a good model? Is that something, how would you do it to really get to where we want to go?
I'm not always convinced that Congress is the best mechanism for defense management reform, because you need to have hands-on within the department to get it right and to do the details. And so I'm a skeptic sometimes of defense management reform. But the healthcare area is actually one where I would urge the committee to keep hands-on. I think that the department is going to be unable to come to grips with this by itself without direct pressure and direct oversight from Congress. I just think that the organization is big enough and dysfunctional enough that it's going to be hard for the department to overcome that.
And one other question. Yesterday we had a hearing really looking at the culture of innovation, and one of the concerns is all the requirements processes and the many layers of people who really want to express their opinion. So how do we help and reform the Fourth Estate, knowing that that's going to be an issue?
I'll just offer, I use the example of DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, and organizations like that have both the flexibility. They exist in the Fourth Estate as a defense agency, and yet due to leadership, passion, vision that they have, and risk-taking, they're able to cut through a lot of that. Strategic Capabilities Office is another one. So supporting organizations like that doing the mission that the nation needs is useful for the committee.
Hey, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Turner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Levine, I appreciate your description as you were giving a list of all the things that we're going to be executing in the Department of Defense with civilians that are not what people consider bureaucracy. I basically heard you describing many of the functions that are at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, which is in my district. And I, too, believe we need significant overhaul of processes in the Department of Defense and areas to find savings. I served as mayor of my community and had to do that in my own bureaucracy and organization. But you made a pretty important distinction, which is how do you preserve, this is not just a civilian workforce issue versus a uniform workforce issue, it's a function. How do you preserve, from a legislative perspective, what's coming from Congress and trying to address issues of civilian personnel, and not hurt those functions? Because we all know what a bureaucrat is, right? A bureaucrat's not an accountant, it's not an engineer, it's not a scientist. I mean, it's these functions that you have that are being executed. There's a product, but I'm not quite certain how you would carve that out. Let me give you some examples. Air Force Institute of Technology is a Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. All the graduate programs for the Air Force, they're programs that no other college or university has, many of which are classified programs. Air Force Research Labs are based at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Scientists, engineers, in addition to being a civilian workforce that manages materials, sensors, UAVs, they also oversee the university research portfolio of the Air Force. Lifecycle Management Center, which oversees a portion of depot maintenance and looks to contractor oversight, has to have engineers, scientists to oversee contractors, and of course the bidding processes. They also have the foreign military sales aspect and have the interface with those with our military counterparts. Human performance wing, scientists, engineers, how we marry our men and women in uniform to technology, and also issues of physiological episodes that we're having. We send it to those engineers and scientists. So how do we take those things, NASIC, National Air and Space Intelligence Center, 3,000 people, largely civilians that are specialists in missiles and what our counterparts are doing. How do we look at trying to streamline and pare bureaucracy, but make certain that we don't impact those functions that are actually being executed as missions of Department of Defense, or in this case, the Air Force, that are inherently going to be civilian functions?
Thank you for that question. In response to the last question, or one of the last questions, I was saying that I thought the department needed to be hands-on with healthcare, but you can be too hands-on in the management area. At the end of the day, management is going to be a leadership task within the Department of Defense. You can't manage the Department of Defense from here. So what I think that the committee can do, and constructively, is to set goals, make sure those goals are reasonable, and that enough time is provided to be realistic that they can be implemented. If you have unreasonable savings expectations, you're going to have irrational action. But if you have reasonable goals, reasonable timelines, that'll keep the pressure on the department, and you have the senior officials of the department come over, establish plans, come over and brief you on that. Mr. Dunlap did that in his time. I did that in my time. I think you need to keep the pressure on that and keep the oversight of that. But the management, the hands-on management at the end of the day needs to be done within the department, and there's no substitute for leadership. What they've got to do is they've got to get into the nitty-gritty of how processes work, what organizations look like, and where there are inefficiencies or where there are unnecessary tasks. And that's just not something that you can do in legislation. You have to do it really with a hands-on management style.
Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses for being here today. Let me start with Mr. Dunlap. In your statement, you provide 4 categories by which to think about agencies and potential reforms. So I'm particularly interested in the last 2 categories. Those are agencies with the mission split between the 4th estate and the services, and those with decentralized missions. So responsibilities for artificial intelligence and hypersonics, I believe, fall into both of these categories. Can you elaborate further on how you would think about reforming the agencies currently responsible for AI and hypersonics so that we achieve and sustain world leadership in each of these areas?
Thank you for the question. I think those are a couple areas, hypersonics, artificial intelligence, that this Congress recognizes as important both to today and in the future. The reason why I mention it is that, and what can often happen is that each entity is trying to do the right thing in and of themselves. But as Mr. Levine mentioned, leadership focus can be important to drive innovation and change throughout a large organization like the Department of Defense. And so I offer those not as thoughts for increasing bureaucracy and overhead, but instead to maintain both vision, passion, excitement, and energy and resources on those capabilities. And so those can take place both in the 4th estate as well as in the services. I mentioned intelligence agencies, satellite developers, things that in the past defense agencies were created to be able to do good things, to achieve efficiencies, gain greater effectiveness by working together. And so I think that's an important tenet. Whether or not organizational change is a part of that is a separate question.
Thank you. So yesterday in this the same room, we held a hearing on innovation, and both witnesses detailed how we essentially have good people working within a tricky system, and that ultimately we should place more of our focus on outcome rather than resources. I'm sorry, rather than processes. Do you agree, or do you feel that there are elements within the defense field activities and combat support agencies that require existing processes to achieve the desired outcome?
My view on defense innovation is that a huge part of the issue that is too often overlooked is money, resources. Are we putting our resources in the right places to promote innovation? If you want to do what the department says they want to do now, which is to try lots of things and be willing to fail, you don't want to be doing that in your acquisition programs. I don't think any of us want to see a major acquisition program where we're investing $50 billion fail. That's not where you try something and fail. You need to try and fail before you get there. The problem that I see in the way our acquisition system works is that the way you get defense development dollars in large quantities is you start a program. Until you have a program, you have nickels and dimes and try this and try that. But if you want the big money for development, it's going to be in a program. Well, once you put it in a program, you can't afford to fail. What we need to do, to figure out a way to do, is to have big dollars out there, substantial investment that we make that is separate from weapons programs so that we can be running prototypes and tests and experiments where we can try lots of different things and be willing to fail. That's not a part of programs where we can't afford to fail.
Good observation. Thank you. Ms. Dunlap, you have anything to add on that point?
I'll just add, I think one of the most interesting comments that I heard, yesterday was that we don't reward people for failing. Now, we shouldn't for wrongful failing, but when you're failing for taking risks, failing early and fast to be able to achieve the greatest effectiveness, we ought to be rewarding those people in the bureaucracy.
Yeah, I completely agree. Support agencies to the Department of Defense play critical roles in addressing the needs of the Pentagon here at home and around the world, and why I support looking holistically at our reform efforts in saving money through efficiencies like headquarters reductions, new technologies, and business practice efficiencies. I also believe that we must tread lightly before rapidly cutting these programs. Where is the sweet spot between preserving these entities and making tough cuts so that we can maximize efficiencies and streamline our efforts?
I'm not sure there is a sweet spot that's known, which is why it should be done carefully, understanding both the pros and cons and impacts of each choices, which is why, I would recommend, a conversation with the department and the agency heads about what can be done and what can't be done and how to move forward, so that that's sort of illuminated through those conversations. And of course, you can't ever quantify enough the value of strong leadership of those organizations too.
Thank you both.
Dr. Winstrup.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. One quick question. Is a Fourth Estate, I assume it's part of the DOD audit that's taking place?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So, Mr. Levine, I want to get into a process, perhaps, but you said many times that we can find savings. You said that, I think, 2 or 3 times at least, and I would certainly agree with you. So what % of the budget do you estimate could be saved?
It depends on what you're willing to give up. I'll give you an example since you just mentioned audit. If I were the master of the universe, I would give up the audit. $5 billion over 5 years, I'd say it's not worth it.
Well, that may be for the Fourth Estate, but I don't know if that's the same throughout the DOD. This is the first audit in the history of America of the DOD, so I'm hoping that we see some benefits from that.
If we had a chance of being successful, I suppose I might agree with you, but I would say that we already know the problems, the deficiencies we have in our financial systems. We know we have a long laundry list of things that need to be fixed. And until we fix them, we're going to continue to fail audits. So to spend $5 billion over 5 years auditing when you already know what the results can be, to me, is not a useful expenditure of public funds.
Well, I can't say that I know what the results are going to be, but bravo to you for knowing what the results will be. But it's hard for us here to really decide what could be cut without the advice from the experts, those that are in the trenches.
I'm sorry, I shouldn't have been so flip. I just put that out as an example of something that people don't want to cut, but there's a lot of money there. And that tends to be the kind of thing that we see if we really want to save big money. We have to make a tough decision, say we're just not going to do something that we would like to do, but it's too much money. And so that kind of judgment about what is it we're willing to give up is something that I think that members of this committee have to reach for themselves. No expert is going to tell you what you're willing to give up.
Well, so audit aside, let's go back to the process of what we're trying to do today. Mr. Dunlap, you talked about peanut butter spread type of cuts, just making it 10% or whatever it may be across the board.
But what if agency leaders were tasked with the notion that if you had to cut 10%, what would that look like? And where would it be? What would it be? Why would it be? And then confer with Congress and appropriators, et cetera, on where we may need to go with that. Would that be an appropriate process to put into place?
So the department, as I understand it, and certainly when I was there, looked at things like that, and I think it's always good to pressurize the system to come up with solutions and choices. You might get a suboptimal solution there in the end because with that approach, you are also looking only within the individual organizations themselves. And to have a large impact in terms of savings or efficiencies, I think you want to think about sort of holistically across the missions. And you may not want to give a 10% cut to agencies that are, optimal, efficient, and highly effective. And so I would just suggest some flexibility in that to be able to pressurize the department as a whole to find out not only where they're going to take those efficiencies, but perhaps even an opportunity to apply those resources in a more effective manner.
Well, but that's my point, too, to what you just said. I'm just asking, say, if you had to, what would that look like? Then we would decide, does it need to be done? Or can it be done and still produce the results that we want to produce? Do you see what I'm saying? So why not have a process where we challenge people to say, well, if I was forced to do it, this is what I would do. And then we take a look at it and say, well, is that realistic? Should it happen? Or maybe somebody comes back and says, I can cut more than 10 and still function well. But challenge ourselves to that process so that we begin, because what is the optimal way then? Either one of you want to answer.
I think you're right that you need to set objectives, and I think that's where Congress can play a role. And there is no science that's going to tell you what the sweet spot is, but you got to use your best judgment and decide what it is. I think that you have to watch out for, if you're going to tell everybody, tell me what you'd cut and come back and I'll decide, you get what they used to call gold watching. Somebody will come back and tell you their most valuable programs, this is what I have to cut. And so obviously you can't do that, so you don't do anything. You need to watch out for that. But I think that in terms of setting goals, my personal view, 25% is way more than you're going to get. But you got to have some goal, or the department, because the department can justify everything it does. There is no activity that takes place in the department where somebody can't explain to you that there's a good reason for it. So if you want to get cuts, you're going to have to set some kind of goal that'll get you some pressure to identify what the low-hanging fruit is.
Thank you. I'm back.
Ms. Shea Porter.
Thank you, and thank you both for being here. I was a military spouse, and my husband actually grew up in the military, so I'm always very sensitive when I start to hear the word cuts or looking at any programs that military communities benefit from. And I have to say, Mr. Dunlap, that reading the testimony when you talked about the big box stores are a 15-minute drive away, I started to think about the people that I knew in the military who didn't have a car, so that 15 minutes might as well have been an hour, because it was not accessible. So that just brings it right down to the ground level of what we're talking about when we're looking at these budgets and how they actually have impact. And so I just wanted to throw that out there and say that there's a community there that needs to be heard. We're sitting here, and I am so grateful for both of you and what you have done and the way you have outlined this, and the testimony is excellent. But it still has an impact, and those kinds of stories might not be told if there isn't somebody sitting here who actually has been in the military or been in a family that can say, yeah, but we don't have a car. Or, yes, but it may only be a 0.5% savings when you go to a commissary, but still that. And the other thing I wanted to say, and I recognize that we have responsibilities and fiscal responsibilities here, but it does seem like it's a small fraction of the overall budget, and I'm looking at the personnel and the impact. My husband talks often with others about what that was like to grow up on different military bases, and that's why I appreciate your comment, Mr. Levine, about the schools, that they had to move to places they'd never been, but they always had one kid that they had come across somewhere. So for all of the moves, and back then there were frequent, I think more frequent moves for many families, there was somebody that they could identify with. My mother-in-law taught in the DOD schools, and they were excellent. There was a source of pride. So what I'm talking about here is community, that when we look at the dollars, we also have to talk about what constitutes a community. We know in our own communities, when we choose neighborhoods to live in, we say, well, you know, where are the stores? Where are the access points for our children? What's their comfort level and schools, et cetera? So I would just urge us as we take out our pens to do budgets that we remember again that these are people who get moved frequently, who leave family, who leave their support systems. And I know you know this, but I want to state it again. And that it is so important for them, wherever they land, that they have a sense that they are in a special community and that we don't inadvertently chip away from that sense of belonging to a community and being part of that. So, Mr. Levine, I want to ask you something about that. You know, the strength of our military is obviously our people, and it's predicated on the recruitment, the retention of the men and the women, and they need to know that their families are always in good care and safe. These spouses and children who form the backbone of every member's career depend on those services by these Fourth Estate agencies, such as DOD Education Activity and the DECA. We know that that's pretty critical to them. So are there any analysis of the impact on recruitment and retention and any impact on family finances and stability as we're looking at this? I heard you say earlier that we haven't really had any recent studies on just simply the costs. What about the cost on these families and our ability to recruit and retain?
There are studies of impact of compensation changes on recruitment and retention. There are models that some of the think tanks have, that IDA has, that RAND has, that will predict what the impact on recruitment and retention is of a change in compensation. Those don't tell you what the impact is on an individual family from some of these benefits. You know, the one family or the family that doesn't have a car and needs to walk to the commissary and can't shop otherwise. So it doesn't tell you about personal impacts. It tells you about aggregate impacts. But we do have studies that tell you that provide that kind of information.
And is it your belief that if we go after these programs, or we in some way find, you know, small reductions or large reductions, that it will have that impact on not just quality of life? Obviously, I've talked about the quality of life, but also on actually retaining.
So I believe we need to be very sensitive to changes that impact the quality of life. Having said that, I think that there are very few things that we do in the department that we can't do better and more efficiently. So I don't see any reason to put something off the table just because it deals with quality of life. We can still be more efficient. We can still do things better. I mentioned in my opening statement the Defense Human Resources Activity, which used to report to me as Acting Undersecretary for Personnel and Readiness. It is a notoriously inefficient entity. It provides vital services, so you have to deal with both of those things. You don't want to cut off the services and programs that it runs, but you want to have it run better. I was privileged to be able to name a new director for DHERA, who is taking management reform seriously, and I believe will reorient it and make it run better. That should eventually result in savings, but it's a hard job, because if you want to produce savings without eliminating activities, you need to look into the details of how your organization is set up, how your processes work. Those are hands-on management activities that can only be done by a manager within the department. You can't do that from Congress. You can only set the goal.
Right, I appreciate that. Mr. Dunlap, would you like to comment on that?
I'd just like to say that I appreciate your underscoring the truth, I think, in general about these agencies, which is that it's really hard to get a free lunch. There's always an impact to get real savings out of any of these organizations. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. And again, I thank you for the work that you've done, because it is critical, and we understand our debt is pretty out of control and that we need to do something. I just want to make sure we target, you know, the right budgets and the right places, instead of inadvertent impacts on military families and communities. Thank you again.
Mr. Gallagher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you both for being here today. I appreciate it. And I know you sort of talked about this broadly in your testimony, but I think it's worth sort of reviewing a little bit and foot stomping, or at least for me it would be useful. Obviously, we've had various efforts in the past at streamlining the Fourth Estate, and you've been involved in a variety of them. And I just, you know, we've talked about the more disciplined use of resources review in 2012, the core business process review of 2014, the delayering initiative of 2015, on and on. Could you distill for me what you think we've learned from these collective efforts on how to embark on successful reform efforts. What was the source of failure? What were the source of success? If you could just kind of distill it down into the bottom line for me, that would be very helpful.
I'll give you one thought, which is, in my view, in management reform, you get what you pay for, not only in terms of dollars, but in terms of time. Top management has to be willing to devote a lot of time and stick with an issue in order to make it work. Mr. Dunlap, when he did the skimmer, had to spend, I'm sure, vast amounts of time. When I was DCMO and I had my savings initiative, the delayering initiative that you mentioned, among others, that was something that was a solid commitment of a big chunk of my time every day over the course of a year.
Sure.
And it had to continue after I left. I hope it continued after I left, but you can't take your hands off the wheel and expect it to happen, and you can't expect savings to magically appear. Frankly, you don't expect much savings in the first year. Mr. Dunlap mentioned with BRAC that there's a 10-year payback period. With most management types of savings, you're investing up front, and maybe it's just the time and effort of management that you're investing up front, but you have to invest up front in order to get payback in the long run.
Sure.
If I could just augment that, I appreciate that. 3 things. Number 1, strong leadership, which my colleague just mentioned, vital through the duration. Second, watch the balloon. I talked about squeezing in one area and it move into another. And third, and perhaps the most difficult for both Congress and the department, which is the tough decisions to cut or reduce or completely eliminate missions. And that often is the difference between sort of marginal savings and significant savings, but of course more difficult choices.
Sure. And I commend your testimony for drawing out sort of how difficult it is to cut missions relative to cost, but how the two are related. Another thing that seems to have come up is a lot of these reform efforts are baked into the FIDIP, so we expect savings redistributed to support other priorities in the out years. So can you just kind of, again, to foot-stamp this, how has DoD planning been impacted by these kind of phantom savings that are projected in future years, but sometimes do not appear?
If you put a wedge in the DoD budget of savings that are anticipated and then they don't appear, what happens is you have to cut something else. And what you usually cut something else ends up being operations and maintenance. And operations and maintenance can impact every phase of your activity and your ability to do and to perform the mission. So if you put in savings and they're not achieved, at the end of the day, you're going to impact mission.
I'll just add that it's tough for any company to run if you don't have realistic projections of what you're going to do and what you're not going to do. So you want to be realistic in your planning and budgeting.
And then if we just kind of look at, even if you adjust for inflation, I believe, and you compare what we're spending today versus the 80s, we were spending less during the Reagan building in the 80s and getting more in terms of quantity. Now, you could say that just as my iPhone cost more than whatever people were using back in the 80s, I don't know, I was like 5 years old, you're paying more for a more sophisticated piece of equipment, but I do think what we're talking about today is the way in which other priorities have crowded out a lot of the things that we want to spend money on, which is to buy lethality and sort of support the direct mission of the Department of Defense. Among those many things, it seems healthcare, just like it's affecting the rest of society and crowding out other priorities, is affecting DoD. As you look at the many problems we face, does healthcare stand out among the rest of them as an area where cost continues to outpace inflation and it's crowding out other priorities?
Healthcare is a big block, which makes it attractive to look at when you're looking at trying to be more efficient. To me, the place you look for a lot of savings is not big blocks, but little chunks. And the example I'd give you is something the department is undertaking right now, which is just to look at all the training programs, mandatory training that they require the troops to put through. Just an extraordinary expenditure of time, which is not going to military training, but is going to awareness training of this, readiness, prep training for that, every program that everybody's ever thought of. It's great to think that you're going to train people, but when you have 15 different requirements and you have to go through this training and that training, the other training, you're distracting from the mission. So that's one example. Another example I give you is when I was DCMO, I looked at the hiring process for the Office of Secretary of Defense. Everybody knew it was dysfunctional, but they just lived with it because it was what the hiring process was. One of the things I discovered was one of the reasons it was dysfunctional was because at some point the personnel authority had been removed from the individual offices, centralized, which is great, except then what the individual offices did, each of the undersecretaries then put their own personnel people in because they didn't trust the central function. And what happened was they spent all their time negotiating with each other. So it would take months and months and months just to get a position description, because the guy who was working for the undersecretary for X would put together a position description, and then he'd have to negotiate with the personnel people over in WHS about whether he was allowed to say that. And they go back and forth over a period of months before they'd even get a simple position description written. So you have to think about consequences of your action. Sometimes you centralize, sometimes maybe centralizing isn't such a great idea. And you have to get into the nitty-gritty of processes like that. And I had an approach that I was taking to untie that knot, but you can't do that without analyzing the actual process and digging in. You don't expect great savings, but if you never look at processes like that, then everybody does what they did with the hiring system is, well, it's just something I have to look at, something I have to live with. If nobody looks at it and nobody takes it on, that'll stay that way forever.
Yeah. Thank you.
I'll just offer to you the Defense Health Agency, somewhere around $34 billion. It's a 25% or so of the Fourth Estate Defense Agency costs. The Congress has done a lot to work on that and reform that, in recent years as well. I agree with your assessment that personnel costs have increased dramatically recently, and that could be, good if we have good people. That may make sense, but healthcare is certainly one of those areas that has increased at a rapid rate.
Thank you both.
Mr. Veazey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to ask both of you about your assessment on the role of civilians as and military personnel and contractors in performing the work of the Fourth Estate. And do you think that we have the right proportion of each of them to do the work of defense agencies and field agencies?
Military, civilian, and contractors are all vital parts of the DoD workforce. We rely on all of them, and we need all of them. They perform different functions, and we don't always have it right. There's some functions that we put military people in which could really be performed by civilians and contractors and would be much less expensive. There are also functions that we have contractors performing where we really need to have organic capability, and we can't and shouldn't be relying on contractors, and you need to have an ability in-house. Your civilian workforce tends to be your institutional knowledge, and if you divest too much of your civilian workforce and lose that institutional knowledge, you may lose the ability to do the job. So it's not that any one of those components of the workforce is more important than the other. They all have their roles, and we need to keep a balance. And no, I can't tell you that we have it right. I think that that's an area which is ripe for reexamination, not only now but at all times. We need to constantly be on top of that to try to make sure we're perfecting that balance.
I want to just specifically ask you about what you think the appropriate relationship of the newly created Chief Management Officer to the defense agencies and field activities should be, especially as it relates to the department's cross-enterprise business functions like civilian resource management or service contracting.
I believe that the CMO, the Chief Management Officer, can play an important role in providing common services and ensuring that that common services are provided in an efficient manner. I'm much less convinced that the CMO should be in the direct management chain for the defense agencies for a couple of reasons. One is that, to me, one of the big advantages I had when I was DCMO, the predecessor to the position, over other senior officials in the department was that my day job was less burdensome. The routine tasks of the office didn't fill up my inbox. So I had time and ability to get into a management improvement program, to take on the issue of hiring in the Pentagon, to take on a $7 billion savings program, because my inbox wasn't always full. Most senior officials in the department, the inbox is so pressing that they have maybe 5% of their time as discretionary that they can spend on their own initiatives. My concern with the CMO being in direct line of authority over the defense agencies is that could overwhelm the office, that it could overwhelm the individual, and that all of a sudden that time that the CMO has to develop management initiatives that cut across the department, you no longer have that time and ability. The second concern I have is that I'm not sure that the CMO right now has the institutional capability, that office has the institutional capability to do that. There are about 100 people in the CMO office, and most of them have relatively routine jobs. They're not the people you would want to have if you were managing all the defense agencies. So if you're going to give the CMO that task, the first thing the CMO is going to want to do is to build up new capabilities. Essentially, you'd be building a new office and a new bureaucracy. I'm just not sure that that's the direction that you want the CMO to go. So I don't tell you it's the wrong thing to do. There are other factors that weigh in the other direction, but those are my concerns with putting the CMO in direct line of authority.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. No, that's very good to know. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time.
Mr. Jones.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and thank you, gentlemen, for your research, your hard work, and being here today to give us, hopefully, some ideas to make DOD more efficient. You know, recently in Stars and Stripes, there was an article written that DOD could not locate 95,000 vehicles in Afghanistan. That equaled out to about $3.1 billion loss. Okay, one other story, and then I have a question. Years ago, John Sopko testified in front of the Senate that DOD spent $6 million to buy 9 goats. Well, it's almost the end of it. Nobody ever picks up to say, well, how are we going to recover the money? How are we going to recover the vehicles? It just is endless. My question to you, because you're an expert in the areas that you're talking about today, why do we in Congress keep increasing the budget? I'm all for the warfighter. He or she deserves whatever we can give them. But the system itself continues to spend and spend in a way that there's no accountability. What would be wrong with putting the responsibility in the office of the Secretary of Defense? It wouldn't happen overnight, but in a period of time, and saying to the Secretary of Defense, you have the responsibility for accountability. If you cannot account for 95,000 vehicles in Afghanistan, then we're going to take $3.1 billion out of your budget. How does Congress, and I've heard some of your comments, I was late getting here, I'm sorry, but some of your comments, how do we put the responsibility, it can't be on Congress, because we will always continue to fund the military because of the families and the warfighter. That I understand, I'm in favor of that. But somewhere along the way, somebody's got to be accountable. And I don't think it's going to be Congress, to be honest with you. I think we've done a great job under Democrat leadership and Republican leadership of trying. But until you put one department or one person overseeing the problem, and that person knows if we can't account for monies that we've lost, then we're going to lose money from Congress the next year. How can we, as the American people, not Congress, how can we get a control of the waste, fraud, and abuse if somebody's not held responsible?
Congressman, I suppose that in a way we're all responsible. Before I went to the Department of Defense, I spent better than a quarter century working for Senator Levin and helping write legislation addressing defense management. Suppose that makes me responsible and accountable. I don't know. I don't know how you do it, other than to say that the idea that you do it by cutting the defense budget, to me, doesn't work. If you're unhappy with performance, you got to go after that performance. But to say you're going to take away $3 billion, well, that's going to come right out of the mission and undermine the mission. So I don't know what the right answer is, but I'm pretty sure that's not it.
I'll just offer, and I think you alluded to some of this, which is a theme that we have been talking about, which is strong, leadership both at the top and throughout, and accountability. So I certainly underscore the need to have people that oversee this in a way that care about the mission, care about accountability and waste and abuse and fraud, and so on, and that the action should be taken. I can't speak to the specific examples that you're referring to, but in general and in principle, I think the Department of Defense certainly wants to be accountable and not have those types of activities happen. I can't point to a specific reform in the defense agencies that would affect that, but appreciate that we certainly don't want those kind of things to happen.
Having said that I was accountable, I want to clarify, I never bought any goats.
Well, I'm going to close in 1 second. It's almost like you're saying there's nothing we can do about it. and that is sad for the taxpayers because we're headed for a financial collapse as a country. Then we won't have any money to pay the troops. Anyway, thank you.
So if I could offer a ray of hope there, I think you can do something, and it's what you're doing right now. You can hold hearings, you can shine spotlight, you can identify problems, and the primary tool that Congress has to hold senior DOD officials accountable is to bring them in here and make them explain what they've done and why. And believe me, it has an impact on the way senior officials of the department manage. They know the power that you have, and they know if they screw up, they're going to have to come in here and report to you on it.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Norcross?
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you for having this hearing. Although it feels like deja vu all over again, and especially to you who've spent so much time. Over the past month, I've spent a considerable amount of my time going through a couple of programs that we're running, the Columbia class, and certainly our warfighters in terms of dealing with ships. And chart after chart is talking about the workload of the workforce building those ships. There's going to be a downplay. We're going to have to lay off people and then rehire them, and how tough it is to keep that quality workforce, which I have to agree with. But it doesn't seem that we have that same conversation when we're talking about eliminating or downsizing parts that affect the quality of life of our warfighters, whether it's schools, the commissary. People, by their nature, are inefficient at times. They get sick. They're humans. And this seems that those who don't have the paid lobbyists tend to get hit the worst. What sort of analysis do you do in terms of the human side, how it affects our warfighters and their families when they go home? Gee, the commissary was closed. We have to drive down the street. That quality of life, that affects the decision-making whether or not they want to remain in the armed forces. How do you go through that set of analysis? Because you have extensive analysis when it comes to the efficiency of building something. How about building the human side of the quality of life for our warfighters? How do you handle that?
Congressman, that is the responsibility of, it's a responsibility at the OSD level of the Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness. There's an entire office that looks at those functions and tries to protect them. Within each of the military services, we have an Assistant Secretary for Manpower and Reserve Affairs who has that responsibility. On each of the service staffs, we have a Deputy Chief of Staff for Personnel, the ones, who is responsible for that. At the base level, we have base commanders who are responsible for that. We have people throughout the military system who are responsible for the well-being of people, of the men and women in uniform.
We fully understand it, but how does it come to you?
And has been and will be a major priority for the Department of Defense. I don't think it's something that the department responsibility of the department takes lightly.
But I don't hear you discussing that today until whether it was Michelle Porter, that side of the equation. How do you deal with that? Just, oh, we can save 10%. That's a nice goal to go for.
I believe that my colleague and I have tried to emphasize that as you look at potential cuts, you have to think about the programs that are going to be cut, and you have to make choices and understand the impacts of your action. I still believe, even so, that there are things that we can do more efficiently, that we can run our business more efficiently. We can run our business more efficiently, even in the personnel and in the personnel area, even when it comes to quality of life. I'm not convinced that the human resources management of the department is efficiently run. I believe, without having done a detailed study, but I believe that we have an extraordinary number of human resource officials in the department at every layer of the organization, and there may be so many of them that that's an overhead factor that could be looked at. So I don't want to say that deals with quality of life, that's off the table. We need people who care about that. We need people who work on it. We need to maintain quality of life. We need to pay attention to that, but it doesn't mean we can't do it more efficiently.
Nobody's arguing with it. So let me ask you a very direct question. Do you think the warfighter and their families say are happier in their service to their country than they were 10, 20 years ago? Do you do any quality of life measurements across the entire organization?
There are surveys there are quality of life surveys that take place regularly in the armed forces. I can't tell you what the
So do you know if they're more satisfied with what they're doing today than they were 5 years ago?
I can't tell you offhand what the trend is over the recent period. I don't know, but I know that those surveys are taken and that information is available.
But you certainly could tell us the inefficiency of many of the other programs. Here's one of the most important. I'm not digging just on you. I'm trying to suggest that is as important as sometimes some of the classes of submarines we buy or ships we buy, whether or not those people who call the military their home or their community is just as important.
Congressman, I'm going to agree with you. It's not only as important, it's more important. Our most important asset is our people.
Thank you. Mr. Dunlap, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'll just underscore Mr. Levine's last point, which is I think the department's people are its most effective capability, and that should always be held in mind. It's hard to analyze sort of the hearts and minds and perspective of people sort of in a quantitative, analytical fashion. And so,
by the way, it's not hard to measure. It's measured every day. They're called the retail outlets. They know exactly what people want, and I think we can know that information also. I yield back balance of my time.
Mr. Russell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen, for being here. There's an old adage that says that which is not inspected is not done. I would find that to be true, and I think in many cases, when we look at the Department of Defense on the personnel side, you've got people actually that are involved with units or involved with programs, and they generally will try to clean up their individual agencies, much like you did when you were working in the five-sided building. But I have to say that there is a solution here. And when you look at the Department of Defense, $700 billion annually is the norm now for its budget, $2.4 trillion in assets, 3 million Americans, both in and out of uniform, committed to defending our republic. And yet, only 1,700 Department of IG staff oversee all of that. Well, there's part of your solution. That which is not inspected is not done. Now, when I was a commander, both on battlefields or in peacetime, if I didn't go down and inspect my equipment or do layouts or look at motor pools or have uniform inspections or do any of those things, I guarantee you that all of those things, like plates spinning on a pole, they'll wobble and they'll break. And I have to totally agree with my colleagues, Mr. Norcross and Ms. Shea Porter. We're not going to see reform and saving or realize anything close to that by eliminating Mrs. Russell's ability to go buy a can of beans in the commissary. I think that's absurd. We have to take care of our people. But the big ticket things, why wouldn't we increase and authorize, instead of 1,700 Department of IG staff for Department of Defense, why not make that 3,400? That cost a lot less than your audit concerns. Really eliminate the audit? Do you realize that the Department of Defense is the only agency ever in the United States government that has never been audited, held to absolutely no account? I'm a retired warrior. Still got a little fight left in me, but we need an audit. That which is not inspected is not done. Here are a few things. Payment to grantee verification. Yeah, we grant all kinds of stuff. Department of Defense improper payments just last year in 2017 accounted for $1 billion of improper payments. I wouldn't call it low-hanging fruit because we like to eat fruit, but there's some weeds that we could pull right there. Department of Defense improper payments. Procurement management. Here's from a recent Department of IG SIGI report, quote, many DOD programs fall short of cost, schedule, and performance expectations. As a result, the Department of Defense regularly pays more than anticipated, buys less than expected, and delivers less capability than its contracts require. And we've been doing it since we've been wearing tricorn hats. So how do we stop it? That which is not inspected is not done. And so, while I appreciate your comments here, and I have great admiration for IDA and so many other great organizations that do so much to promote proper defense of our republic, we have to have accountability. We're not going to realize it off of, Ms. Shea Porter's dependents or, you know, Mrs. Russell being able to buy beans at the commissary. We're not going to do it that way. We're going to do it by going after these bigger programs. And you had made mention, and I agree with your comments, Mr. Levine, about the big dollars that get sucked into these programs and then they're locked in, and it creates enormous inefficiency. And I would suggest to you that as a Congress, we owe ourselves to bolster programs like DIUX, SoftWorks, SkunkWorks, things like that, where the innovation comes out, where you have something actually developed, and then it ends up going from, wow, this works, can we immediately get it fielded, and then we just fund it. Those things work. Big primes provide big things and a lot of implements for the things that we come to rely on, but they also buy up innovation and squash it. And so I would hope, Mr. Chairman, as we look at the problems in the future on the Fourth Estate stuff, we could bolster those innovative programs to prevent some of that waste. We're all frustrated with it. I even found myself associated with Mr. Jones' comments on Afghanistan today. That's a rare thing, being an Afghanistan veteran as well. But he's right. Our overseas contingency dollar programs are three biggies right now. Where's the oversight and accountability? Mr. Chairman, I don't really have any questions, but I would suggest that we ought to do everything we can to increase the Department of IG numbers, even double them, and we'll get to billions right away. Thank you. I yield back.
Y'all have any comments?
Mr. Chairman, I think those were helpful comments, and frankly, I agree with the point that if it's not inspected, it often doesn't get done. I think that you saw some examples of that with previous management reform efforts at times, and one I would point to is in the 1990s, we cut back quality inspection on our major acquisition programs, and what we discovered is when we cut back the DoD inspectors, the contractors responded by cutting back their own inspectors too, and so we had quality problems. More recently than that, the reason that the Test Resource Management Center, the DTRMC, was created was because the Air Force was neglecting its major test facilities. It was allowing really valuable assets to atrophy. It wasn't putting the money in them. We created an oversight entity. So it's not just IGs who look at things. Other people have that responsibility for the inspect and oversight and can bring attention to these kinds of problems and make sure that important issues don't get neglected.
Let me just pick up on that for a second, because it seems to me one of the ways we got to where we are is, okay, and I'll just take this example. Air Force is neglecting its key test things. What do? We create another office that's supposed to oversee them to make sure that they take care of their test resources, rather than hold the Air Force accountable for doing what they should have done to begin with. And isn't it true that over time, that layer after layer, and we're as much, Congress is as much responsible as anybody of reacting to a problem by creating a new process or a new bureaucracy. You think I'm wrong?
I think you're right, Mr. Chairman. I would say that in the case of the test resource management, that the number of people who actually review the budget, to me, budget review is a plus. The number of people who actually review the budget for the MRTFB is relatively small. I think that most of the budget of that entity is for investment in test capabilities, science and technology investment in test capabilities, the National Cyber Range Complex. They maintain important capabilities. There's a handful of people who review the service budgets, and frankly, that's at the core of what OSD's job is to review the service budgets and make sure they're spending their money wisely.
But there is also a separate DoD entity responsible for independent testing.
There is, but it doesn't have the responsibility for the test base, for the investment in facilities, which is what TRMC does.
Yeah. Okay. Let me, if I can, just go back to the beginning for just a second. My sense is, as one looks out not only at business, but at nonprofit and essentially every sort of organization outside of government. The trend in recent years has been flatter organizational structure, savings in the back office. The supporting functions of the key missions have been reduced or at least squeezed to gain greater efficiency so that more resources can go to the core mission. And yet, the Department of Defense, anyway, has not kept up, at least to the extent that all the rest of the world has in that regard. Now, do you all agree or disagree with that premise?
I would say that I believe that's a constant focus of defense management. I believe that was Mr. Dunlap's focus when he was doing the skimmer. It was my focus when I was done in the DCMO, when I was working in the DCMO. Nonetheless, you're absolutely right. More needs to be done. More always needs to be done on this. I would point to the Air Force was, when the Army was working on its delayering activity, there was the report that came back was that there would be times when the Army Chief of Staff would issue an order to a subordinate and it would have to go down through 13 different people, and a couple months later somebody would do the job and then would have to report back up to 13 different people, and by the time you'd played that game of telephone, the job that was done was completely different from what the Chief of Staff had asked for. So of course you have to look at that, and you always have to look at that because it builds up over time and it will continue to build up over time. If you don't keep fighting, you're never going to get there.
Sir, thank you. I certainly agree with the trend that I see in industry, and I think that I completely agree with you, and flattening the organization can be making it more effective. I think there's a natural tension between that, as I tried to allude to earlier in my opening statement, where there is a good chunk of those agencies in the Fourth Estate that are more direct mission than they are overhead function. And so looking at sort of the overall budget of the defense agencies and activities as a whole, and putting a specific target on that, and thinking that that can be achieved purely through efficiencies and delayering might be optimistic, because I think you really have to cut into mission, which I commend you for thinking about that and sort of your opening volley that you put out this week. So I would just offer that I completely agree with you, but I also think to achieve the savings to be able to put towards the warfighter that you're talking about, cuts to missions are going to have to be made.
Okay. Well, let me just pick up on that for just a second, because even, and I'll use Defense Health Agency as an example, even if you say they're doing their mission, perfectly, which I take your point that they're not, but even if you say they are, there are certain supporting functions within that organization. Their business practices, their real estate management, their logistics, their contracting, their personnel management, and those things can be improved across the board. I mean, we tend to think of it as all our charts do like this, but there's some commonalities here across the Fourth Estate where greater savings and efficiency as well as compatibility could be achieved. That's my premise. Tell me what you think.
I agree with you.
I agree. We tried to get to that in 2013 as well, to dissect overhead versus mission functions, and any reform going forward ought to consider that. So I agree.
Yeah, and to me, that's I don't know if it's going to be 25%, but that's a lot of where some of this can come from is in some of that back office.
So, Mr. Chairman, you have two tasks though. One is to separate the overhead from the mission, and then to figure out how much you can cut the mission. And I think that looking at the defense agencies, it's important to recognize that's not the overhead. There's a lot of mission in there.
Yeah, no, I understand your point. Mr. Levine, I want to just ask you once again, because you talked at the beginning about the Defense Finance and Accounting Service. One of my suggestions in my proposal is to look at, I know them by acronyms, I've got to look at exactly the Defense Contract Audit Agency and DCMA, wherever that is.
DCMA, and Defense Contract Management Agency.
Defense Contract Management Agency, yeah. So we have three separate entities that are essentially dealing with finance and accounting, which as I've tried to drill down, the difference in responsibilities is not always as clear as maybe I thought it was. Can you comment, because you talked a lot about DFAS, but talk about DFAS in connection with DCMA and DCAA and I guess to some extent the Comptroller's Office in how all that financial management.
DFAS works for the Comptroller and is essentially the finance and accounting, the authoritative finance and accounting entity for the Department of Defense. So they're the ones who are responsible for DOD's books. They have to work with others to do that, but they have the accountability. DCMA and DCAA deal with acquisition. They don't deal with finance and accounting. So DCMA is an acquisition support agency. They support program managers and contracting officers by doing on-site inspection and on-site management of contractor facilities. DCAA is a contract audit agency. That's different from what DFAS does because what they're doing is auditing contractors. They're not doing DOD's finances. They're looking at contractor finances. So three separate functions, three separate agencies.
And I guess the essence of my question is you believe there needs to continue to be three separate agencies to do each of these discrete or each of these responsibilities.
I do because I believe they're discrete responsibilities. This is an area where I think you can achieve efficiencies within any one of those, but I don't think that they can appropriately be combined. My particular concern with combining DCMA and DCAA, for example, is DCMA is an acquisition support activity. It's part of the acquisition community working for them. DCAA is an auditor. They have to maintain audit independence. If you combine them, then you lose the audit independence. GAO is going to say that none of their audits are valid, so you have a problem.
Yeah. Do you have any opinion on this, Mr. Dunlap?
Yeah, I think we've actually had, at least in my experience, some successes. So I mentioned DFAS consolidating on their own some headquarters functions, which is good for efficiency. DCMA, is often out there with the contractors, and so they'll catch things in support of the contractors early. DCAA kind of comes in on the backside with the audit, and they can actually report out, as they did for me, particular metrics on the cost savings that they've been able to find. Now that's retroactively. You'd like to get ahead of that in the process as well, but each have their own function.
Okay. Let me just ask about one other area right quick, and that is DLA. And Mr. Levine, you talked about how you believe that DLA has made great strides in improving its management and so forth. I'm probably like a number of members, and I remember, I don't know, 2 or 3 years ago, a number of news articles about vast warehouses they didn't know what they had, throwing things away, and a number of items that at least called into question their ability to manage their inventory and to get items where they needed to be on a timely basis. I mean, I want you to elaborate a little. Do you think they have overcome those problems? But then secondly, I'm also looking at commercial companies that I can click on and have something delivered to my front door that day or the next day, the just-in-time sort of approach that business is using. And so I would appreciate from each of you an evaluation of DLA's ability to meet the military's needs in the context of the way that business has also moved. Understanding, DLA will never be exactly like Walmart or some business. I think we can all agree with that. But have they kept up, at least with those trends?
So when I first looked at DLA in the early 1990s, they were a mess. They didn't know where anything was. They couldn't track what they had. They lost things. There were reports that things would fall off of trucks, and the truck would arrive, and they didn't even know something had fallen off because they had no idea what was coming. They have made tremendous progress in their own system. They have asset visibility systems which allow them to know what they have in much greater detail than ever before, pretty much comparable to what's available in the private sector. Not only that, they have come to rely on the private sector. So where in the 1990s they used to stock things like medical supplies and hardware, they figured out 15, 20 years ago they didn't need to stock those because they could buy them from the commercial sector. And not only could they buy them, they could rely on commercial distribution networks so that they could have hospitals, medical supplies, for example, delivered directly to the hospital. It's never touched by anybody at DLA. So they are dramatically more efficient today. I won't tell you that that means that they don't have problems. They still do have problems. The one that always comes back up is the unneeded inventory that they have on hand, the excess inventory. What I would say is there's more work that can be done on that, but that is largely a consequence of demand signals that they get from the services. I think I'm going to need this. And by the way, these are critical spare parts, so I've got to have delivery within 30 days when I need it, and they're unique builds, so you're going to have, in a 9-month advance time, you're going to have them on hand, or airplanes aren't going to fly. So you have a lot of stuff that you have to have on hand, and then sometimes the product is discontinued, we don't need it anymore, and we're stuck with that on hand. But it's a consequence of a need to be responsive, which DLA has because it's servicing military hardware in a way that the private sector doesn't necessarily have. It's not just a matter of avoiding the error in terms of not buying too much. It's at least as important to avoid the error in terms of not having a critical part on hand when it's needed.
DLA is an interesting case, not only because it's the second largest agency in terms of revenue that it oversees, but also sort of historically. So it, at least to my understanding and reading, it had not done well, and then it sort of turned its game around and started being much more successful in terms of logistics, delivery. It split off DCMA actually from DLA in the 90s to focus on logistics, delivery. It gained sort of more efficient, effective notoriety in the department, and then became perhaps recently more of a victim of its own success, where it began to be asked to take on more and more responsibilities sort of outside the core logistics and fuel delivery. It provides nearly 100% of the fuel for the warfighters, for example.
If I could, DLA now provides personnel support services. It now buys IT systems. It does things for other parts of the Department of Defense because they've been good at it, and so this is where they get additional assignments that can become a problem.
Yeah, so I think sometimes it's hard when you take your eye off the target of what your core mission is and get diluted, and it might be time to think about those additional missions that were added that could possibly be done elsewhere. And in that sense, I think it might be a victim of its own success. That said, I think where it can look to adopt commercial practices or use commercial vendors directly is an excellent idea. Won't always work getting fuel to your ship in the middle of the ocean, but in other cases, it could be the right choice.
Well, just two things right quick on that. Number one, I'm hopeful that our e-commerce provision, which is on the way to being implemented, can assist for basic off-the-shelf commercial items, and that can include some medical equipment, which can provide that delivery. Secondly, we are hearing recently about advances in artificial intelligence that can improve predictive maintenance so that you don't have, 10 things on the shelf just in case, but you have a database evidence that can give you very much higher probability of when you're going to need what to repair. And my hope is that can not only make DLA more efficient, but also as we move towards additive manufacturing may also play a role.
Mr. Chairman, I think you've correctly identified the next frontier for DLA. Better algorithms to predict use and identifying, the just-in-time manufacturing with 3D can get you out of having to stock parts in some cases. So identifying those kinds of uses of new technology is probably the direction they need to go. But I still say, for what they're doing, they are so much more efficient now than they ever were before, and so much more efficient than a lot of other parts of the Department of Defense that they really ought to be given credit for that.
Yeah. Oh, Susan?
Yeah. Mr. Chairman, I was just going to say, I think it's been, you've been excellent in trying to help us see where some of the pitfalls are in moving forward, and at the same time that we need to move forward. And I want to just thank you for that. I think we want to move in that way very thoughtfully, not rhetorically, not just, I think people are always concerned that you can make cuts that may sound good, but a lot of people can get hurt along the way. And I think that the discussion today has been helpful in understanding that there's a lot more to this. It's not as easy as it looks, and yet at the same time, it's an important thing for us to be doing. So thank you very much.
I appreciate it. Actually, that's what I was about to say to wind up. I think it is important to acknowledge the efforts and the progress that's been made. Both of y'all have had part of that, and the folks who work at the Pentagon now are looking to take the next steps. we, I believe, have a key role in also pushing that along. But the purpose of all this is not just to make cuts. It is to have more resources in the hands of the warfighter faster. And as everybody on both sides of the aisle keeps reminding me, we don't have unlimited resources around here, and the world is not getting any safer. And if we're going to meet our obligations when facing sophisticated adversaries as well as terrorism, as well as the other threats around the world, we're going to have to make some of these reforms in order to meet those obligations. Thank you both for being here. I'll just alert members that in approximately 15 minutes we will reconvene upstairs in 2216 for a briefing on some of the management initiatives underway at the department. The hearing now stands adjourned.